Okay, we are recording. I'm Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College. I'm joined today by Jonathan Neufeld, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy and affiliate in the Department of Music at the College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina. Thanks so much for joining me today, Jonathan.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
Okay, so we are talking about your paper, Aesthetic Disobedience, which came out in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism in 2015. And so just to start off, can you just sort of briefly go into what aesthetic disobedience is?
Sure. So there is a way of thinking about, so the sort of change and breaking rules has been central to art for a long time, to such an extent that people often talk about artists as revolutionaries, right? They're revolutionary in their field. The revolution of whatever perspective made a massive difference in painting, blah, blah, blah. And so thinking about change in these sort of political terms, revolution in this case, has been a sort of commonplace, especially in the 20th century. But it's also gotten to be a little bit of a cliche in a way, I think. And people and the connection to the sort of actual political meaning of revolution, which is the replacement of one set of norms with another, one constitution with another, has been lost. Moreover, it is almost never met in artistic practice. So it's a kind of overblown description of a certain kind of change in artistic practice. And so I think that often in artistic practices, something more limited where an artist is aiming at a particular norm or a particular set of norms, and they break them in order to highlight the way we do the practice and the way we should continue to do the practice differently in the future is a better model of thinking about certain sorts of aesthetic innovation and aesthetic changes, artistic innovation and artistic changes. Put an asterisk by my conflating those two things here. We might talk about that later. And so I think that civil disobedience is a nice model for this sort of change. And so aesthetic disobedience is meant to mirror civil disobedience, where the goal is to do what I just said a second ago. It's to break a certain set of norms within the art world in order to draw attention to broader shared norms that are not being satisfied when we merely follow these other norms or something like this. So breaking a law, in the case of civil disobedience, in order to call attention to certain shared commitments or shared values that we have politically, morally, whatever. I don't care what those values are. So there's some dispute about what values count. So we'll just set that aside. So you break a law in order to call attention to certain shared values that the current way the law or the current way the art world, in the case of aesthetic disobedience, is set up, fails to satisfy, right? So that's the general gist. I just wanted an account of change that was more limited than revolution, which is overly common, that captured deliberate rule breaking and that captured the sort of the institutional structure of the art world that artists are often protesting as they make art. And there are a couple of sort of salutary consequences of this that we'll get to in a second, but let me just stop and make sure that that was clear enough.
Yeah, no, that was absolutely clear. Thanks. So one thing that I really like about the paper, right, in this idea of aesthetic disobedience, well, there's several things, but one of them is the sort of democratic ethos that sort of underlies it, right? That it's not merely artists who are doing this thing, sort of like this romantic notion of sort of the artist is the center of all value in the arts, and they're the ones who get to break the rules. But the audience plays a role in this, right? If there's no uptake, right, by the audience, then these, aesthetic rule breakers or artistic rule breakers, right, sort of end up in dead ends, right? Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So I'm glad that you brought it up because this is the sort of central push and my central the thing that drives, the reason that I talk in political terms in the first place is because these practices, I think, are nicely, are well considered when we consider them as public practices, public democratic practices, where all participants, all citizens of the art world have a sort of say in how the art world is shaped. So you're exactly right that the structure of aesthetic disobedience, where norms are broken in order to draw attention to shared commitments that we have generally, those norms might be broken by anybody, and in a number of different directions. And so we'll talk a little bit later about the kinds of norms that might count, and this will touch on why I was squirrely about aesthetic disobedience versus artistic disobedience. Jerry Levinson has taken me to task on that. But the main takeaway that I hope people get from the work is that art worlds are happily considered to be democratic structures, or structured by democratic norms. So yeah, good, thanks.
Yeah, right. Rather than sort of this authoritarian,
Right.
the artists are in charge, or I guess aristocratic, right?
Right, right.
Something of that
And
sort. Yeah.
and it's not that this is descriptively wrong all the time, right? I mean, oftentimes, in classical music, or in lots of different art forms, some more obvious than others, it has this sort of top-down look, and it drifts toward this sort of top-down authoritarian look. And if we think about art worlds as democratically structured, then this is a sort of that we have a way of critiquing that authoritative structure, I think. And so the happiness of the democratic account of art worlds that I'm giving here, that I'm relying on here, I think gives us a way of making sense of and critiquing things that are sort of creepy about I don't know, bad forms of classical music, for example, sort of violation of the sort of thing that art is meant to do.
Yeah, right. And so not only can artists perform acts of aesthetic disobedience, right? Like breaking, Wagner breaking the rules of, classical harmony or something of that sort, allowing in a lot of dissonance and so forth, but also members of the audience can also perform acts of aesthetic disobedience by, examples you talk about, like booing during a performance of classical music, interrupting, theatrical production by audience members storming the stage and refusing to get off despite the actors and directors trying to pull them off the stage and so forth.
Right, or speaking along with what's going on stage, and participating in ways that are sort of next to what's going on stage, but you're not authorized to speak for the character from the audience, but actually taking that control to move it in a different direction, encountering a monument that's up on a pedestal, and so it says aesthetically, right, it's to be revered and not to be touched, and interacting with it in a number of ways that it's initially not really designed to be interacted with, whether that's defacing it or projecting things onto it, or having a variety of public performances against the meaning that's being promoted by it, around it, that audiences can take on these aesthetic protest roles against a work in this way.
Yeah, right. And I mean, on that example of defacing monuments, right, that this is incredibly timely, right, that your paper is more timely now than it was in 2015.
Yeah.
Right. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, right, that the Robert E. Lee monument in Richmond, Virginia, right, was defaced, and so forth, and Confederate monuments sort of throughout the South have been defaced or vandalized. And those acts aren't merely acts of aesthetic disobedience, they're also acts of civil disobedience, right? Because it's public property or state property, or something along those lines, and you're breaking the law in harming that, not merely sort of violating an aesthetic norm of, we should, this thing is important, we need to have, awe and reverence for it. It's there to be looked at and appreciated. Let's just not do that, right? That would be, violating an aesthetic norm. But it's a violation of law, right?
Right.
And so could you go into cases of that sort, which I think are really rich and interesting cases?
Sure. So let me just say a quick thing about why it's still. So you gave a nice account of the difference between aesthetic disobedience and civil disobedience. Super simple way of putting it. Aesthetic disobedience aims at reforming the art world. Civil disobedience aims at reforming the political legal world. Right. So the targets are different. The methods might be the same in each case, but the targets might be different. And so you get a bunch of cases that overlap. And the monument case is a nice case of overlap, not just because the aesthetic norm. So I'll object to myself. You might think that the monument case is just a case of vandalism and is really just nothing more than political protest, right? But I think it counts as a case of aesthetic disobedience because it makes you, as you said, rethink the way we are obligated to interact with monuments, what monuments are for, and how we should both treat monuments and what kind of monuments we should continue to produce. And so there's been a huge effect in the public art world on what kinds of monuments are appropriate to put up, whether counter monuments make more sense to put up, whether putting monuments that exist now but whose message we disagree with, whether we simply take them down, whether we destroy them, whether we publicly humiliate them, whether yeah, all sorts of things that we can do to them. It's brought this to the center of the consideration of the consumption of public art and the production of public art. So I think it's clearly a case of aesthetic disobedience, what's going on, what has gone on. Even while the one of the central targets of that is this reforming politically how we think about our own history and so forth, and breaking the law in order to reform the way legally we put up monuments, we maintain monuments, and so forth. So it plays the same act plays this sort of double role, right? Or it can be seen from two different perspectives. So there are a bunch of cases that act like aesthetic civil disobedience. So civil disobedience where where some aesthetic component is central to the sort of public message that's trying to be delivered. And tons of acts are like that don't at the same time try to reform the art world, right? And so maybe some sort of, I just gave such a compelling case for monuments that I wonder whether they all count actually as aesthetic disobedience now. But you can imagine cases where you just take an artwork down illegally, or you deface it, or you do something to it where you're not really aiming at reforming the art world, but you're just breaking the law in order to send a message to the city council, not this particular statue or something like that. I was going to neatly distinguish that, but now that I'm thinking about it more, and now that I gave that argument that I just did about the effect on how we put things up, I wonder if it isn't always both, right? If illegal interventions into monuments at certain points in time aren't always both aesthetic disobedience and civil disobedience. So setting that aside, here's another example. So there's oh, I'm going to forget their name. Shoot. Here, let me check just for a second. So there's a disability protest group whose name I will remember in 1 second, who did, so the group responsible for the Capitol crawl. Do you remember their name by any chance? So the Capitol crawl was, while the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, was being debated in Congress, a bunch of people who were who couldn't walk and were mobile in a variety of different ways came to the bottom of the Capitol steps, which they couldn't possibly go all the way up, and stepped out of their wheelchairs or out of whatever assistive devices that they had and crawled as best they could up the Capitol steps. So it was this incredibly striking tableau of protesters, very deliberately performed, very theatrically performed, that had an essential sort of aesthetic component to it that took elements, didn't take elements, but was at least harmonized with elements of modern dance, a whole bunch of stuff, as they crawled up as far as they could the steps of the Capitol, that drew huge media attention and that constituted their act of civil disobedience in blocking the steps of the Capitol, right? So same thing with a bus protest in St. Louis. I want to say they blocked the progress of buses in just the same way, that were inaccessible to them. So here you have an act of aesthetic disobedience where the aesthetic component is central to the communicative message of the political, without it's also aiming at reforming an art world, right? So the conceptual distinction is nice, I think, and necessary, I think. Thanks, Brian Socek, for reminding me that I needed this distinction. And so distinguishing between the targets of the protest, I think is important. And it again shows how aesthetic interventions by a wide variety of people in a wide variety of practices can have this important deliberative and transformative effect on those practices, whether they're political or aesthetic.
Yeah, right. That it's sort of central to your view that with aesthetic disobedience, the act is communicative, right?
Right.
It's meant to communicate something to an art world, or with acts of civil disobedience, right? It's meant to, be a form of civic communication. It's meant to sort of announce something, draw attention to something to the public at large, right? And I think, there could be an interesting question of, when we're dealing with acts of aesthetic civil disobedience, right? Not merely acts of aesthetic disobedience or civil disobedience, but the combination of the two, right? Is there sort of a blurring of the public and the art world, right? Because presumably, within any, nation or state or group, there are subgroups, and, within, the Western world or America, there are all sorts of art worlds, right? There's just not one sort of homogenous art world. There are all sorts of art worlds that exist, and the boundaries are getting blurred. And part of what may be happening here is that we can't as easily distinguish between the aesthetic, the art world, and the general sort of political world, as nicely as, say, formalist theorists would want to make that distinction.
Right. And would be a really nice objection to my distinction. It would be a diagnosis of why I was having trouble in the case of monuments, finding a sort of pure case of political, of aesthetic civil disobedience and not aesthetic disobedience, not being aesthetic disobedience at the same time, because monuments are sort of internally political within the art world, the section of the art world that they occupy. It's hard to imagine it's not being sort of woven into politics, both in funding, both in public location, and in the sort of reason that they have for being in the first place. So my floundering there, I think, illustrates your point that, look, these are not neatly separated practices, politics and aesthetics in this case. They mush together in all sorts of ways. And so I have a nifty taxonomy of a variety of different sorts of aesthetic protest, right? And as with all taxonomies of human practices, they become really dicey in the middle. And one of the interests, so at the end of the article of aesthetic disobedience, I talk about Tania Bruguera. Sorry, my Spanish is terrible. And she actually gives us a pretty good example of someone who is for sort of erasing those boundaries and making artworks into just social practice, right? So there's this urge that I think should be resisted, but there's this urge to conflate the two and to say that art worlds just are nothing but the social world more broadly. And so you have the same obligations and the same sorts of acts that you do one in the other. And I think this robs aesthetic disobedience and aesthetic civil disobedience, and a lot of Bruguera's own work, it robs it of its force if you just make it into ordinary protest, and not an artwork doing this protest, right? There's a charge that artworks get because of the distinctness of the art world, at least conceptually and historically, it's a loss if that disappears, I think. It might, and we might just make them into ordinary social practices, art performances and artworks. But again, I think that the distinction is valuable, even if there's the squishy middle first, and second, even if you want to have two different practices like politics and art. And sometimes certain sections of the art world just internalize politics in such a way that you can't really distinguish the two. I feel like I just made a big muddle and went ooh at the end.
That's okay. On the sort of relationship between maybe the political and the aesthetic here, right? I think there's a question of, what do we do with bad artists, right? So, we've been talking about monuments, and those are works of art. And, some of those works of art are, a way of memorializing and a way of, as Tina Nguyen talks about monuments and memorials as ways of sort of a public or a group making commitments to itself over time, right? And, Confederate monuments are committing perhaps people in the present to crimes of the past.
Right.
And so that's a reason to deface them, tear them down, destroy them, or, put them, as was done in Eastern Europe with some Soviet monuments, like put them in like public parks where they sort of have been decontextualized in a way that they're robbed of their political power. And now they're just sort of things to look at and, have mock and deride, right? Unless like you're still, a pro-Soviet and like you sort of look back longingly at these statues. But sort of shifting away from art that has, immoral messages to artists who, maybe their art itself isn't problematic, but they themselves have become problematic individuals, right? Thinking of J.K. Rowling or Woody Allen, right? And in cases like literature and film, television, right? It seems to me not to allow for aesthetic disobedience, or maybe even aesthetic civil disobedience, in quite the way that monuments or painting or music, right, public performances can allow for. And so, what are your thoughts on that sort of issue?
Yeah, so bunch of things. So first, I'm glad that you focus on different media, because I think different mediums, because I think different mediums have different norms and have different sort of requirements for have different ways of disobeying those norms in interesting ways. And so it's really hard to actually be disobedient in some mediums, and it's much, much easier in others. So classical music, it's really easy to be disobedient because the norms are so strict and so old fashioned and so traditional, that like like coughing too much, really opening that plastic candy wrapper for a long time might be disobedient, right? So easier to be disobedient there than in other mediums. And the like television, film, literature question is interesting because your first, when we talked about this a little bit beforehand, and so we both had the same sort of thought about how to protest Rowling, for example. And this, you can imagine fan fiction that embodies, that makes the characters trans and has sort of a positive view of being trans or something like this, is anti-Rowling's view of gender. And you have a really good fan fiction that enters into the Harry Potter universe, that just exemplifies values that are clearly not Rowling's. But this is just sort of ordinary critical fan fiction, right? There's nothing, so it's well within the norms of literature and literary criticism to do that sort of thing. So it's aesthetic protest, but it's not really aesthetic disobedience, since the central norms of literature aren't really violated, I think. Um, there might be, and so it got me thinking about what you would have to do in order to have an aesthetic disobedient act, and aesthetically disobedient act within literature, or I think this applies to movies and TV as well. And it gets harder and harder the more capacious the norms become, and the more sort of stylistically broad literature becomes first. But then I thought that if you, part of the, when targeting the art world is, so targeting art world institutions and the norms that constitute those capacious formal norms is a way of attacking the way an art world is. Part of the reason, hold on one second. Sorry, I should have muted. Good. Part of the reason that Rowling has the clout that she does and has the platform that she does is the sort of the material underpinnings and the way that the media and criticism treats someone who has sold a lot of books, and it gives her this sort of massive platform. And it makes the content of the books have more clout than they might otherwise have. And it makes so claim one. So you might attack that sort of material foundation of the way the books are put into the world. And so you would get, in this case, it would happen to overlap with civil disobedience. So you could just secretly put out J.K. Rowling books, like an apologetic how many Harry Potter books are there?
There's
6?
7.
7, okay.
Yeah.
Put out the 8th book where it's revealed that half the characters are trans. Something you read a convincing Rowling book, pass it off as a Rowling book, and sort of violating the material underpinnings of Rowling's empire. Maybe something like this, but it's hard to, without a sort of fundamental, sort of old-fashioned Marxistly revolutionary act in cases like Rowling or cases like Woody Allen. It's hard to imagine the kind of violation that wouldn't just amount to good, interesting, cool aesthetic protest, right? But that was the best that I could do. And the lesson that should be drawn from this is to remember that the targets of aesthetic disobedience are not just what we normally think, what you said earlier very helpfully, that are just the sort of formal core of artworks, but the institutional practices that sort of support that sort of formal core and the way the art world is going now. So protesters and aesthetic disobedience with an imaginative engagement with these practices may well find institutional targets that don't on the surface look like formal targets, but on my view would still count as aesthetic norms supporting the art world.
Yeah, right. And so
Constituting the art world.
Yeah, so I mean, thinking about the Rowling case as you were talking, right, that, one possibility that came to mind was, you do like a Harry Potter giveaway, where like you're giving away copies of the novels, right? And what you've done is you've taken the novels and changed them slightly, right? In ways that,
Nice.
that are, very explicitly, have characters, alter the characters in such a way that, some of them are queer, some of them are gender fluid, some of them are non-binary, some of them are trans,
right.
And you just give those out to families, right?
Right.
At your own expense, you pass it off as J.K. Rowling, even though, this is your work that's sort of an appropriation of her work, right? Authorship is a norm that matters deeply, both aesthetically and, legally.
Good.
Right.
Right.
And so, you're breaking the law and breaking an aesthetic norm at the same time.
Right. And your example again before when we were chatting of redubbing Manhattan, so
Yeah.
that it's just a critique of creepy molester would
Yeah.
be a nice example. But it's challenging in these really entrenched, sort of formally entrenched practices that have entrenched forms of criticism and sort of performative criticism and of satire of itself, like this entrenched set of satire norms. It's really hard to have something that really counts as aesthetic disobedience, as a breaking of those fundamental norms of the practice, it turns out. So, but that seems fine to me. That it's that it's in some media it would be difficult to break norms is fine. It's just, it used to be easier to break the norms of theater. Now it's harder because the norms of theater have become very, very fluid, which shows that acts of aesthetic disobedience are historically indexed, and what once would have been a form of protest, no longer a form of aesthetic disobedience, no longer is. And that's fine. And I suppose it might be the case that things become so, we become so used to breaking rules that it becomes sort of internal to the practice that we break rules. But then I was on a panel with Casper Holden, who is the director of the Royal Opera House. And we were talking about director's theater, and I was talking about aesthetic disobedience. And he was like about director's theater because it's so old hat, right? He was an enfant terrible for a while. And now he said, you know what, I think the most disobedient thing for me to do would be just to do it like a straight up, utterly authentic, musically perfect version of Don Giovanni. Like that would be so totally 18th century, and just an exquisite version of that. That would be real in Germany, like that would be really disobedience. So, which he is right? It depends where the practice is, what counts as a sort of fundamental critique of norms, and which norms you're picking out to critique.
And it's even sort of personally indexed to him, right? That what would count it for him to be aesthetically disobedient might not be the case for someone else.
Right. Yeah. And that's, if I were smarter and quicker right now, I would find a way of connecting that back to J.K. Rowling. There's something about having a certain kind of star power and a certain kind of literary or musical expectation attached to you that allows you to tailor protest to that person in a way, or that like that person's corner of the practice, which the bigger they get, it becomes more and more exemplary, right? So targeting Rowling is to target a certain way of being in the literary world. Ditto with the director of the Royal Opera House, right?
Yeah, right. So, maybe in addition to having the pro-trans characters, or the very sort of open conception of gender characters, and like your fan fiction that you're passing off as her, it's largely plagiarized, right? You have sort of the bad guys are all TERFs. Right, they're all like they all like say things that J.K. Rowling has actually said in interviews or in tweets and so forth. Right? Voldemort is really just becomes her.
Right, and that like the evil spells would just become tweets of hers or something. Right? Maybe you could Latinize them.
Yeah. I like that. I think that's a good place to end. So on that really awesome note, thank you so much for joining me, Jonathan. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. It was really fun. And I'm so glad that you're doing this. It's fantastic. So thanks.
Thank you.
All right.